Good evening. My name is Rainey Reitman. I am the Activism Director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I also am a very proud board member of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, and I also am a co-founder and board member of the Freedom of the Press Foundation. So a great variety of the organizations that I care passionately about are up here on this stage tonight, and I very much wanted the opportunity to introduce them to you and to introduce you to these amazing panelists, all of whom have been incredible inspirations in my own life and are experts in surveillance issues. Tonight is not just a panel discussion. We are certainly going to be hearing from experts about NSA surveillance issues, the law, the politics, and where we go forward in fighting back to maintain our privacy. It's also a fundraiser. That means that tonight we all have the opportunity to show our support for two incredibly worthy organizations. One, the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, the other, the Freedom of the Press Foundation. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit more about what those organizations do and why they are worthy of your support at the end of tonight's, at the end of the initial panel discussion, before we go to a question and answer section from the audience. But I wanted to introduce you to the idea that it was a fundraiser, so that as you were awed and inspired by these fantastic speakers, you could also start thinking about how you might want to contribute to the larger movement pushing back against NSA surveillance abuses. I'm going to introduce each of our panelists, and then I'm going to introduce our moderator for the night. And I am going to start from the far left, my left, with Norman Solomon. Norman is a longtime journalist. He is a media critic. He is a tireless anti-war activist, and he is the co-founder of rootsaction.org. He's the founding director of the Institute for Public Accuracy and is the author of War Made Easy. He's an amazing speaker. He's a phenomenal president, and we're incredibly lucky to have him tonight. Thank you for coming, Norman. Yay. Right next to Norman is Cindy Cohn. Cindy works with me at the Electronic Front. Yes, we should stop and give her a hand of applause. Cindy is an amazing woman. For many of you know her work with the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Before she did that, she spent 10 years suing Chevron for their involvement in murders in Nigeria. She's still involved in defending human rights activists all around the world. Thank you for that work, Cindy. She serves as the legal director and general counsel for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a nonprofit based in San Francisco, California, that defends digital liberty, civil liberties in the digital world. And she is the counsel for two active cases against National Security Agency surveillance abuses. And she is also helping us make national security letters unconstitutional. They had a huge victory last year where a court finally found that national security letters were unconstitutional. She's doing absolutely amazing things through impact litigation. And right next to her is Shahid Bhuttar, who is the executive director of the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. And Shahid is one of the plaintiffs that is suing the National Security Agency, his organization. I don't even know where to start with Shahid. He is a constitutional lawyer. He's a grassroots organizer. He's a writer, an independent columnist. He's a musician and a poet, and he has had a huge influence on my own life. And if you haven't had a chance to meet him, he is really something. I urge everybody to walk up to him after this and have a conversation with him. And that's 400 people, so I hope you have some time set aside. And last but not least, please give me a round of applause for Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel needs no introduction, but I'm going to give a very brief one anyway. He is the iconic whistleblower behind the Pentagon Papers. He is a national hero that Henry Kissinger described as the most dangerous man in America. Because of his bravery in blowing the whistle, he faced trial. He faced charges under the Espionage Act, theft, and conspiracy. He was facing 12 counts that would have put him in prison for 112 years. And today he's standing with us, a proud champion for free speech and a co-founder of the Freedom of the Press Foundation. Thank you for all your work, Daniel. Tonight's moderator, I'm happy to say, is Bob Jaffe, who tons of you know already. He was the law clerk on the Hedges versus Obama case, which is a case challenging indefinite detention without trial. And he's going to be moderating this discussion. He's well known for defending draft resistors during the Vietnam War. And he mentioned that he was actually in law school during the Pentagon Papers releases. And I have actually found out that tonight is Bob Jaffe's 75th birthday. So I'm going to bring Karen up here, and she's going to lead us in a round of happy birthday.
Yeah. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Bob. Happy birthday to you. Yay.
Good evening, everybody. Try and suppress the fact of your 75th birthday. In fact, I turned on my Google page this morning, and the Google page had dancing cakes, birthday cakes, okay, with "Hello, Robert." Okay, it's like, my God, where is this coming from? And of course, we're dealing with electronic surveillance and all of those issues. So it's a great opening line, actually, to be talking about that. Welcome, everybody. This is what's that? Of course, yeah. Dan says it's from. Okay, how about now? You got it? Good. Excellent. Welcome to St. John's. This is our second in a speaker series. We had one last June, right after the revelation of the Snowden revelation of NSA illegal unconstitutional surveillance. This is the second one, and it is on illegal surveillance. Normally when we do events in Berkeley, civil liberties events in Berkeley, we say, well, we're just preaching to the choir, okay? But we're doing a lot more than that tonight, because we're videoing this event, but we're also live streaming to the rest of the country and to the rest of the world. Wonderful videographer John Peroulis. Bright path. I'm going to get to the event. We're running a little bit behind tonight, and I do want to have a chance for a forum. In everybody's seat, you'll look in front of you, in the pew in front of you, you'll see a card, okay, with a pencil. We're going to have a forum. Just please write your questions. You can do it during the program. We have 4 wonderful speakers. Write your questions. We will be collecting around 9 o'clock, okay? We'll have an extra fundraising period of time, and I believe we have a poem to be read by Shahid Bhuttar. But let me just get to our program tonight. Illegal surveillance, unconstitutional surveillance by the National Security Administration. It's not new. It's been happening off and on since the 60s. Daniel Ellsberg is going to cover the history of that. And It can only arise really out of broken institutions, and that's what we're dealing with. That's why we're here. We have a Congress that cannot do its oversight. And Shahid Bhuttar will be talking to that. We have a broken judicial system that is not working. We have a Supreme Court that lays down a gauntlet against seeking redress for illegal surveillance. Worst of all, maybe, is the FISA court, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which meets totally in secret, totally. The government prosecutor is the only party in that court. The opinions of that court are kept secret. There are no published opinions. The legal memorandums that are filed by the government prosecutor are classified as top secret. That's part of why we're here. And Norman Solomon and Cindy Cohn actually is going to address those issues. We're also here because of a broken media that doesn't ask the right questions, that doesn't push hard enough. Ironically, we have, as a check and balance, the alternative press, the bloggers, Amy Goodman. We have the wonderful UK Guardian. We have a number of publications here that actually acts as the check and balance. Norman Solomon, our speaker at the end, is going to address those issues. We have, as we did last time, we have two questions. The first question is a general one, which is 2 minutes for each speaker. It's the same question. The second question is 8 minutes, and is particular to each speaker to cover these individual topics. So I'm going to get to the first question. Let me just read you a quote from someone who I believe is attending this event tonight. And she wrote me this email, and this is what she said. "This is so perfect. I've been wanting to learn how to move from getting the information out there to educating people on how to protect themselves and their loved ones. Also, how to explain that their inaction is actively hurting every other person in the world. I want to tell people that no one knows if they are breaking the law anymore. No one can say they have nothing to hide. Everybody has secrets until now, of course." So the first question of each panelist, 2 minutes, talk about your own experience, as did our attendee write to me, of the almost Orwellian technology that impacts our lives. What does it mean to have the government secretly intrude into our private lives? Let's start with Norman.
Well, I think of all of our efforts to create a better world and how the government's willingness and capacity to subvert our civil liberties makes our own existence into an Orwellian experience and makes 1984, as we now know, seem like a vast understatement. For some reason, Bob, as you raised that, I think of something that the psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton wrote about designing of nuclear weapons. And here we are in 2014, and like so many people, I become aware that the two great threats to the generations coming after us are the risks of nuclear weapons conflagration and climate change. Both of those industries, so to speak, that are hurling us towards those catastrophic results of our lack of democracy are harnessed by agencies like the NSA and the CIA. And the political economy, the militarism, the warfare state are all inextricably bound up with this surveillance state. It's not happenstance, it's not runaway technology, it is the absence of democracy that is making all of our lives, if we're awake, include wondering whether we should put our cell phones in the refrigerator. That's no way to live, that's not what the Bill of Rights are about, and we've got to struggle against it.
Cindy?
I think that I'm a constitutional law geek, and so I think about why is it that the Constitution cares about things like our privacy? And I think that it cares about things like our privacy because it's trying to maintain the fundamental tools that we need to actually have a working democracy. And I think that when the government is watching everything that people are doing, even the specter of the government watching without knowing who they're spying on, and of course we don't know who they're spying on, that creates a chilling effect. It makes people afraid to organize. It makes people afraid to have the private conversations that are necessary in order to build towards the public conversation about who we want to govern us. Every social movement in this country has had to start with some pretty private conversations. And that's why when we wrote, I'm going to talk a little about the case, but the case that I'm filing papers in tomorrow and is filled my head is the First Unitarian Church versus NSA case, where I proudly represent the Bill of Rights Defense Committee and 23 other organizations, all of whom are engaged in trying to make social change. And they range from people who disagree completely with each other, from the California Gun Owners Association to the Students for a Sensible Drug Policy, to People for the American Way, to Greenpeace, to the First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles. And the thing that draws them all together is the fact that all of them need to be able to have a private conversation in order to try to make their social change. So when I think of almost Orwellian, I think about our ability to govern ourselves and what happens when that goes away.
Thank you. Shahid.
Maybe I'll start with a personal reflection from my family's history. I'm an immigrant to the United States. My family moved here when I was 2 in 1976, and we were essentially religious dissidents from a country in which we were reviled as heretics for believing what roughly amounts to the Unitarian Universalist doctrine, right, like the Muslim you use. And so we were brought to this country by very much the same principle that brought its founders, the freedom of belief. And the right to believe what one thinks is integral to democracy. And I think that when we think about surveillance in terms of privacy, it underregards the issue that Cindy was framing, the right to an unpopular opinion. And when what used to be constitutionally protected becomes then an emerging zone of thought crime, it's not just the people who have something to hide whose interests are impacted, it's anyone who lives in the society that is deprived of their voice. And just to pull an example out here that people I think often forget, in the 1990s, well before 9/11, what used to be free speech became acts of terrorism, particularly by the radical environmental movement and the animal rights movement. And before Muslims, first they came for the trade unionists, then they came for the communists, and then they came for the Jews, and then they came for me. A lot of Muslims think that we were the first in the line, but environmentalists came before us, and civil rights activists before us, going back into the Cohn era, and people advocating for women's suffrage even before that, right? So we stand in a proud tradition of people who've been marginalized for asserting some independence of thought, and I think that is particularly the value that is at risk today.
Dan. Okay. Thank you.
Well, you ask about personal experience. Of course, I was the first American ever prosecuted for a leak, for an unauthorized disclosure of classified information. Prior to Obama, 2 other people were indicted for that, 3 altogether in the almost 90 years since the Espionage Act was enacted. And Obama has now, depending how you count, 7, 8, conceivably even 9. A couple of the cases are not so well known. One just very recently. More than all the other presidents put together then, use of the Espionage Act. Now, Snowden has said today, in fact, that he could not come back to this country and expect a fair trial, and I think he's exactly right. The legal situation environment has gotten much worse than it was in my day 40 years ago. But even then, when it was quite likely, there was a good chance that the Espionage Act in this application to people giving information to the American public would be found unconstitutional. There was strong legal scholarship that says that that use, which was first used against me, was unconstitutional. As a matter of fact, I won't go into it now, I've just recently learned that the legal advisor, the aide to my judge, had advised that my lawyer's motion that the charges should be thrown out as unconstitutional. He agreed with them, the legal aide, and he said that my judge actually was inclined to agree but wanted to put it off until the end of the trial, until he'd heard the testimony and see how it went in application. Now, that didn't come about because he had to throw the case out because of crimes against me by the president, which faced him with impeachment and led to his resignation. But those crimes had to do with fear of what I would yet release after the Pentagon Papers. Snowden, for the rest of his life, will be encompassed by fear of the NSA and the executive branch of what he may yet reveal or might have left to reveal. And 40 years ago, what the president did to shut me up at that point included warrantless wiretaps, then illegal, using the CIA against an American citizen in a variety of ways, then illegal, and in fact bringing 12 CIA assets to incapacitate Ellsberg totally, quote, incapacitate Ellsberg totally, whatever that meant, on the steps of the Capitol on May 3rd, 1972. All of those measures have now been proclaimed, the last one by the president, others by the Congress, to be legal now. So I think Snowden could expect that wherever they can get at him, and very definitely in the United States. Today, he was actually answered for an hour, question and answer, and I encourage you all to look that up on the web, easy to find, Q&A for Snowden. He would not be able to do that here at all, as I was able to do continuously while I was on trial for 2 years because I was out on bail. He would not be out on bail. He would be in the kind of isolation cell that Chelsea Manning was in. You may reflect on the fact Chelsea Manning was arrested 3.5 years ago. You have not seen a Q&A by Chelsea Manning during that period. You have not seen one interview with a journalist of Chelsea Manning, and that would be true of Snowden. He can only be telling us what why he did what he did and what his reflections are on the country because he's out of the country. And I think he expects to stay there, and I think that's just what he should do.
Thank you. We'll go on to the particularized question. It's interesting to note that with all of the broken government, what we really have left are the Chelsea Mannings, the Edward Snowdens, the Julian Assanges, Barrett Browning, who's awaiting trial, and Jeremy Hammond, who's already been convicted. And that's, okay. Anyway, that's what we have, and that's what's helping us to fight back, along with the alternative press and media. So let's go to the questions now. Dan's going to answer the first one, which is, and this is 8 minutes, talk about the history of NSA, FBI, and CIA surveillance abuses of U.S. citizens and the current surveillance state. How does the surveillance state under President Obama and its almost Orwellian technology and power to spy on its citizens affect our lives, our privacy, our freedom? As a whistleblower, talk about the contributions of Ed Snowden, his connections to the Freedom of Press Foundation, and what do you think will happen with him? Tell us what we can do at the grassroots level to resist and protect ourselves.
Okay.
8 minutes.
I can never remember when I started on my watch here. I'll try to I've already said that I was personally subject to warrantless surveillance, which, when it was revealed, ultimately at the very end of my trial, showing that the FBI had consistently lied under oath when they said earlier that there was no overhearing of Daniel Ellsberg, Finally, with a new acting FBI director, Ruckelshaus, after Pat Gray had to withdraw from nomination as head of the FBI because of a number of crimes he had committed, including burning information about me, extenuating circumstances, in his home fireplace. And Ruckelshaus was then told by somebody in the FBI there was, after all, overhearing. And my judge ordered it to be brought to his attention so that he could see whether it affected the case. And they couldn't find it. And the reason they couldn't find it was that on advice of Mardian in the Department of Justice, the President Nixon had ordered the files of the illegal wiretaps, which as crimes ordered by the President, gave J. Edgar Hoover blackmail power over the President to keep himself in office. To get those files out of Hoover's private safe, Hoover had kept them out of the official files, and transfer them to Mardian and then to Ehrlichman in the White House, so that Hoover could not blackmail him in them. And the files were eventually found in Ehrlichman's safe. Now the fact is, this is now 1973. Under Johnson and Nixon, the NSA, FBI, and others, the Army Intelligence, for example, had been conducting widespread surveillance of activist groups. But a burglary, just months before the Pentagon Papers came out, in Media, Pennsylvania, office of the FBI, a break-in by 8 activists, nonviolent activists, had revealed tremendous surveillance by J. Edgar Hoover of activist groups of all kinds and of congresspersons. I think he had 833 files on different congressmen in different administrations, senators and whatnot, journalists, and in particular black organizations of all kinds. Hoover had an obsession about the possibility of a black messiah, and as you all know probably, had used wiretaps of Martin Luther King Jr. To try to blackmail him, even suggesting that he commit suicide, lest these tapes be revealed. So this is what had been going on under Hoover. Now, was this, the president was telling us the other day, President Obama, we needn't fear misuse of files of this sort. He said, we're not based on trust, except trust me on this. Granted that it might be abused. Yes, well, water might flow downhill also. In the case of Hoover, he was the longest-serving public servant in our history, over half a century. Why was that? Because he had frightened, blackmailed every president with information that he had on his private life up till that time, and members of Congress, journalists. He was the most trusted man. The president told us how NSA people are family men, they have children, they are in PTAs, they go to church, they do this and that. What does he think? What kind of Americans were the FBI people? Thousands of them who had been carrying out this illegal surveillance all these years. What kind of Americans were they? No different from the NSA people, no worse, no better. Hoover himself, why was he the longest serving? As I said, because no president could bring himself to fire him. Why were their budgets up every year? Same reason. And why was he the most trusted man in America, one of the very most trusted men in public life in America? Because he had a perfect press, which he had achieved by favors to newsmen, favored newsmen, punishing others that he didn't agree with. This is what is to be expected from people who have this ability to pry into the private lives of, in those days, it couldn't be everyone. So it focused, it was targeted pretty much on just the people that could serve the FBI and, let's say, NSA right now. What are we doing here? To have the power of, or I should have the knowledge of every private communication, every dealing of any kind, credit cards, whereabouts from your iPhone, emails, faxes, text, chat logs, and everything, things that didn't exist under the East German Stasi. They simply didn't exist at that time, or Hoover. Think what Hoover would have wanted to do with that information in general. to have one branch have that power over every member of Congress, every member of their staff, every journalist and every source, and every judge, every judge. Can you really have three separate independent branches when one branch has that kind of blackmail power and influential power over the other two? That should answer itself pretty easily, and we don't. We don't have this independent branches now at all. The system of checks and balances that was designed into our system is broken, absolutely. And what Edward Snowden has given us, Edward Snowden, not the NSA, not the president, Edward Snowden has given us the gift of a constitutional crisis, as distinct from a silent coup some a dozen years ago, as distinct from a creeping, silent, unnoticed erosion of our Constitution. He's confronted us with a situation of a looming danger that we might do something about if we act in time and we act fast enough and resolutely enough. The president, in his speech, I would say the other day, has shown himself unmistakably what I already suspected. He is part of the problem. He's facing we are now told by Snowden with documents, unequivocally, that we have a constitution that's not only been under attack for a dozen years, but it's been losing, it is failing, it's in bad health, it's been injured. The Fourth Amendment is virtually dead. Not quite, but virtually dead. And what the president has offered is not even the aspirin or the Band-Aids that he appears to be giving us, but sugar pills, placebo, that have no effect on this at all, whose only intent is to assure us that there's nothing to worry about, that we should have confidence in situations in a system that do not deserve our confidence. People have asked, who elected Edward Snowden? To tell him, he's kind of commented on that and said, well, I was elected by these practices of NSA and whatnot. But who elected him? As somebody asked me the other day in an interview, why should we trust him, this 29-year-old, the president mentioned his age too, 29-year-old, to make the judgment as to what the public should know and what it shouldn't, what should be classified and not? Well, in respect to that question of what should the public know about what NSA, Snowden's organization, was doing, is doing, will do, and what it means, who is to be trusted? The people who kept that secret, who chose, who made the judgment? That means the leaders of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, Dianne Feinstein specifically, Mike Rogers, others. Are they to be trusted? Is their judgment to be trusted? How about the presidents, the head of NSA, the director of national intelligence, who simply lied to us about the program, and we know that only because of Snowden? Or trust Snowden, the man who put it out at this point? Well, it's clear to me, and which I trust on that question. And somebody said to me incredulously when I said that, he said, you mean you trust, you think he's more trustworthy than senators, than the president and whatnot? And I felt like saying, well, looks that way, doesn't it? If you look at the evidence. The fact is that Edward Snowden has done more to defend and support our Constitution, and specifically the First and Fourth Amendments, than any current member of Congress, any member of the official government, any employee of the executive branch up to and including the president. And unfortunately, the law in this period, we could go on more, but I've used up my time, I take it. But I'll just say, I've already said earlier, his coming back would not serve anybody's interest because he would not get a fair trial. He would have the same result that I got when I was asked by my lawyer in the first case ever held here. Probably none of you have ever heard this. I was asked by my lawyer on direct examination, 4.5 days on the stand. He wasn't allowed to call me Dr. Ellsberg. The prosecutor made a motion on that. Mr. Ellsberg, why did you copy the Pentagon Papers? Immediate objection from the prosecutor. And although Leonard Boudin tried to get that question in 4 or 5 different ways, the prosecutor got that objection sustained. I was not allowed to tell the jury why I had copied the Pentagon Papers because, as the prosecutor said, it's not an element. Motive is not an element of the defense, of the offense, he said in this point. That remains true. Snowden would not be able to answer that any more than I was, which means that a trial would be basically a farce. So we owe him, I would say, the debt of the challenge to change this situation, and that means by bringing pressure to bear on Congress to live up to their constitutional obligations in a way that none of them have done on these committees in terms of defending and supporting the Constitution, which is the oath they actually take, and regain our democracy. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Shahid Bhuttar, who will cover the lack of oversight of Congress. Shahid, your question is, please give us an update on the Presidential Commission recommendations and Obama's responses and the relevance of the Privacy and Civil Liberty Oversight Board's forthcoming report, which just came out today. Also, talk about the oversight by Congress of government surveillance and its failure to demand accountability of the NSA. What can we do as citizens?
So let's start with the congressional oversight piece. I'll work my way back to the review board that reported its recommendations to the president last month, and then the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, which issued its first report today. And then I'll close with grassroots action opportunities available to you here in California. First, with respect to Congress, it's amazing to see how many members of Congress in the wake of the Snowden revelations have claimed correctly that they had no idea any of this was happening. And it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek to hear from the authors of the Patriot Act that they did not intend their signature legislative achievement to be abused in the way that it has been. But in their defense, the executive branch, under presidents from two administrations, has in fact interpreted one of its central provisions, or one of its many provisions, in a way that is itself secret and opaque. Just to dovetail there, one of the PCLOB's recommendations today was for the government to reveal its secret interpretation of Section 215 of the Patriot Act. That's the section at issue in the telephony metadata capture. It's the basis for the first of the Snowden leaks, and it's particularly been very central in the debate. But the point I want to draw out here is that Section 215 is one among dozens of collection authorities. It's a big part of the puzzle, but a part of the puzzle, and the president in particular has not even thought about addressing, or at least publicly claimed to have addressed any of the others. So Congress for the last 10 years has been legislating in the dark. The Patriot Act has been reauthorized several times in 2005, again in 2009, several times under President Obama alone, and in each of those instances, it had no idea what it was legislating. In the most recent reauthorization of the FISA, that's the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act amendments, let me tell a quick history here. So in the era that Daniel was taking down the Nixon administration, as Congress investigated the FBI and the CIA and the Pentagon for spying on the American people, it imposed a series of measures, among them the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, to keep domestic surveillance from strangling democracy. And when President Bush in 2000, I believe initially in 2002, authorized what was then called the President's Surveillance Program, and then later the Terrorist Surveillance Program, at one point prompting a threat of a mass resignation from the Justice Department. This might discomfit you. Attorney General John Ashcroft, people remember him, right? With respect to civil liberties, he's the best Attorney General we've had since, including the current administration and Attorney General Holder. That should be a very disturbing prospect for anyone who lived through that era. But so, Ashcroft, Mueller, an entire rack of senior Justice Department and FBI officials threatened to resign over the first version of this program because it was so violative of civil liberties. Something changed, and it assuaged those particular people. If you were to ask me what the changes were or why they would give anyone comfort, neither I nor anyone else here could tell you, because that all is secret. like the 6,000-page report that the Senate Intel Committee has compiled documenting torture under the Bush administration far beyond what anybody knew, just like the rest of the Snowden leaks. After all of the different revelations of the past year, we still reportedly have only seen somewhere between 1% and 2% of the documents that Snowden has to share with the public, which is to say we've still seen a minuscule tip of a vast iceberg. And when we go back to Congress and we think about the legislative debate that's taking shape now on the Hill, one takeaway I want you just to keep in the back of your head is that the debate on the Hill and in the press and by the president are fighting over scraps. They are marginal debates about portions of a more vast program, which it's worth noting Congress attempted to stop in 2003 when it was actually presented to them in transparent terms. When total information awareness was presented to Congress, it chose in 2003 to defund those programs. This was an effort under the executive branch pioneered by Admiral John Poindexter. Does the name ring a bell from anyone? Smoky mirrors, cigars, right? And if it doesn't ring a bell, just Google Poindexter and Iran-Contra. That'll take you to his sordid past. So he shows up in the wake of the 9/11 attacks proposing that the government should have the ability to see anything, anywhere, all the time. And Congress says, that's crazy, get out of here. And what happens is the executive branch built it anyway, piecemeal, across different agencies, in DHS, in the NSA, in the FBI, in the NCTC, in the DNI. This might sound like alphabet soup, and it's supposed to. That's why they did it this way, right? It is intentional obfuscation of an agenda that was rejected when it was actually presented in transparent terms. So the current congressional debate, you're going to hear a lot about two bills in particular. I want to share with you a third. The two you'll hear about, one has been introduced by one of your senators, Dianne Feinstein's FISA Improvements Act of 2013. That is the right response. Senator Feinstein, in her capacity as chair of the Senate Intel Committee, has been entirely complicit in mass warrantless surveillance. This was a committee born from the investigation enabled by the break-in at the Media Pennsylvania FBI office that Daniel referenced. It took Congress 2 years to compile tens of thousands of documents revealing what the U.S. Senate in 1976 described as, this is a quote from the Books 3 of the Church Committee, a sophisticated vigilante operation aimed squarely at suppressing the legitimate exercise of First Amendment rights of speech and association. That's what the U.S. Senate found the FBI doing in 1976, after which it imposed these controls that have then since been watered down in the post-9/11 era. So the regime that was put in place to contain domestic surveillance is eroded. And the FISA Improvements Act, this is Senator Feinstein's proposal, would be the latest set of revisions to that law. In 2008, it was revised to essentially enable much what the original statute had been passed to prohibit. And the proposed 2013 revisions by Senator Feinstein would purport to limit bulk collection, but with exceptions that would swallow the rule, which is to say it would basically let the NSA out of the very vestigial cage that remains around it, and it would legalize and give statutory backing to essentially otherwise illegal unconstitutional executive action. The bill you will hear about weighing against it, and I would strongly encourage everyone to look at it closely and share your views with your respective members of Congress, is the USA Freedom Act. It was authored by the original sponsors of the Patriot Act, bipartisan bloc of senators and congresspeople from both sides of the aisle, both chambers in Congress, and it would be very meaningful as a first step towards restoring the civil liberties eroded over the last decade. It would, among other things, end bulk collection by the NSA. It would enable the FISA court to hear a balanced argument from a qualified opponent on the other side of the government. It would enable greater transparency by giving the private sector the opportunity to disclose information in the aggregate to the American public. It's a very meaningful bill. I want to also share with you a third that is currently under the bus, and I think it might appeal to those of you in the audience, particularly because it was sponsored by the man who I would describe as the smartest member of Congress, an actual rocket scientist, a former Princeton physics professor, Rush Holt, who was at one point chair of the House Intel Committee before Nancy Pelosi stripped him of his seat on the committee for being too aggressive in his oversight responsibilities. He has a bill called the Surveillance State Repeal Act, which would, you should clap for it, it would essentially repeal the Patriot Act and the 2008 FISA Amendments Act. It would force the agencies to justify the expansion of their powers from a pre-9/11 baseline. And that's important because remember, 9/11 was not caused by a failure of intelligence collection. It was, to whatever extent anyone wants to blame it on a particular point in the chain, it was information sharing, right? Collection was not the gap. So all this stuff that the NSA claims is necessary, you can't buy any of that. None of that is true. And the Civil Liberties and Oversight Board today released its first set of findings. It found, among other things, that the NSA's warrantless surveillance has not ever actually proven helpful in an actual instance of terrorism, which should make you wonder if it has such grave constitutional faults recognized by a federal judge, by the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, by the President's own review board, by the President himself as a candidate for the White House in 2008, how then do we accept it as the law of the land? And the flat answer to that is we, the American people, never have, right? The Patriot Act has been incendiary and controversial across the country and across the political spectrum since it was first enacted. The response to the Snowden revelations indicates to an even greater degree that we, the American people, do still mean it when we say we want to live in a land of the free. And when you look at the congressional landscape, the Surveillance State Repeal Act offers the strongest opportunity to realize those principles. The USA Freedom Act, a useful step on the road, and the Feinstein-FISA Improvements Act is a red herring of which you should be very skeptical. Last thing I want to say here, just with respect to what you can do in your own capacities, you in California have 2 unique tracks available to you. One of them, I believe you are getting cards handed out to you on the way in. My colleague Art Persico here in the front is holding a card up in the air now for the Shame on Feinstein campaign. This is a transpartisan grassroots effort to call on Senator Feinstein to do 2 things. 1, withdraw her red herring piece of legislation, and 2, step down from the chair of the Intel Committee to let somebody who's going to do the job step into her place. You are uniquely situated to help support that campaign because you, somewhat uniquely relative to the vast number of people around the globe who have an interest in these issues, are her constituents. So it gives you particular influence. I would encourage you to use it. The second thing you can do here, there's a new bill that was just introduced in the state Senate last week. I'll ask Matt to call out the bill number. Thank you. 828. It's the latest of a bill being introduced around the country. In Washington State, it will soon, if not has already been introduced in Utah, as well as Oklahoma, Tennessee. We're working on Maryland. This is a bill to deny the NSA access to state resources like water and electricity, like the public universities, like your state prosecutors. These are opportunities to escalate. They're available to you every day. The work we do at the Bill of Rights Defense Committee is to work with concerned people from all walks of life like you to help you raise your voice. Please stay connected to us. Please connect with somebody new while you're here tonight. Movement building is entirely about expanding our networks and finding ways to demonstrate solidarity, and I'm looking forward to your questions later. Thanks for coming out tonight.
We'll all have a chance to ask questions of the panelists, and that'll come after this portion of the program. So for Cindy Cohn, attorney for Electronic Frontier Foundation, tell us how this secret court works, the secrets of the secret court, and the machinery that allows the constitutional, in quotes, machinery that allows this court to redefine and reshape and shred the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. What's different now about telephone metadata than it was 30 years ago when the Supreme Court ruled that telephone records can be disclosed? And tell us what you think is the future of litigation against the NSA.
Great, thank you so much. I am very proud to be here. I'm very proud to be counsel to both the Bill of Rights Defense Committee and the Freedom of the Press Foundation. Don't I have great clients? I'm happy to talk about the court. Does this sound okay? The secret FISA court, we've kind of been telling a historical story. So the next thing that happened under the secret FISA court after the revelations in the Pentagon Papers, the Church Committee, was an attempt to try to bring some of the national security surveillance that the government was doing under some semblance of rule of law. And the ultimate compromise was to create a court that approves national security surveillance, but have that court meet in secret, and that's what the FISA court is. And I think that the original idea of the FISA court, I've never been a fan of it, but it was about approving targeted surveillance, individual warrants, and it was supposed to be aimed at people who were spies or agents of a foreign power. So in the instance in which the government wanted to spy on somebody who they thought was a spy, they would go to this secret court and get a warrant that looked just like the kinds of warrants that the regular law enforcement get, which also happens in a one-sided process, and then go ahead and do the spying. Okay, well, there's a lot of legitimate criticism for that, but what happened under the Patriot Act is this whole model got turned in a very dramatic way, and in a way that I think makes it extremely problematic. The first thing is the FISA court doesn't approve individual warrants when it comes to a huge amount of the surveillance it does now. It approves these kind of blanket, weird, abstract warrants. Rather than identifying individuals. And this is the big shift that's underlying all of the issues I think that we're talking about here, is a shift from targeted surveillance, where the government has to make a showing where they get access before they get access to people's information, to one of mass surveillance, where the government collects everything first and then sorts out second whether it got anything that it really wanted. And this is the fundamental shift that we have to turn back around as a country if we really want to get our rights back. So the FISA court's role got expanded dramatically, but in some ways their power got limited, because they don't get to look at what the NSA is doing. They just get to approve these abstract warrants, and boy, did they sign off on them. The numbers are really high on the number of judges and the number of times that they've signed off on these broad warrants. So there's a lot of problems with the secret court to begin with, and it got worse after the Patriot Act. And of course, as others have mentioned, there's only one side there. There's an old joke about grand juries that the prosecutor could get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich if they wanted to, because we know that in adversarial systems is one of the gems, one of the important parts of our democracy, which is there's two sides to every story. And anybody who's only telling you one side of the story could probably get you to convince anything. I'm not sure this group would indict a ham sandwich, but maybe you would. And that's one of the biggest problems. You asked me next about Smith versus Maryland. That is the structure of the phone records collection program relies on a court case from 1970s called Smith versus Maryland. And it's kind of crazy when you think about it, because this case was about a guy who'd stolen somebody's purse and then started making crank phone calls to her and threatening her. And the government got access to his phone records for a period of 2 weeks to be able to confirm that the suspect that they already had in mind was the guy who was actually making the harassing phone calls. And they used a very primitive thing called a pen register that really it just shows the numbers you dial. It doesn't actually show if the phone connects, right? That's the case that the government claims has settled this whole question of whether they get to spy on everybody. Well, let's just do a short little, I'm filing a brief tomorrow with this. Can you tell I'm really deep in it? It was about one guy. He was already a suspect. They had reasonable suspicion, and they did it for 2 weeks. We've got everybody, all the time, no targeting. And by the way, we all carry phones around with us now, so your phone number is you. It's not the people you live with. It's not a big thing. We all carry phones around with us. We use them much more than we used in the 1970s. And a phone number is almost a unique identifier for individuals, except in pretty rare circumstances. So the idea that this whole thing rests on the edifice of Smith versus Maryland is something, next time somebody says, oh, well, it's legal, just giggle. I mean, it doesn't pass the giggle test. So that's the Smith versus Maryland case. The cases that are happening right now, I have been suing to try to stop the NSA surveillance since 2006, since Alameda resident Mark Klein The original NSA whistleblower is a man named Mark Klein who lives here in the Bay Area. I should have invited him tonight, damn. Who came to my organization with evidence about a NSA installation in the Folsom Street building, AT&T building. It's on 2nd and Folsom. If you're going down Folsom on your way to the Bay Bridge, you go right past it. It's that Darth Vader-looking building that doesn't have any windows until you get about the 6th floor. It has the AT&T logo on it. There's a room in there that you can't get into unless you have NSA clearance, and that all of your internet communications are being copied and routed into. Mark brought us that information in 2006. We've been suing to try to get the court to look at that seriously. Also, the phone records program was revealed in 2006 as well. I mean, to the extent that anyone's claiming that Mr. Snowden did something that was incredibly dangerous and alerted our enemies to the NSA's telephone records program or upstream mass surveillance program, I guess they're positing a terrorist who hasn't looked at the court records that are publicly available since 2006, because I've been suing over it. In any event, the original case we brought was against AT&T. The government, you guys might remember, the government gave retroactive immunity to the phone companies and killed that case. And we launched another one called Jewel versus NSA. And then after the Snowden revelations of the summer, we launched the First Unitarian Church case that I brought to you. And what we're doing is we're using the First Unitarian Church to go after the telephone records part of the program. And we're using the Jewel v. NSA case to go after the upstream collection, the Folsom Street facility, and facilities like it across the country that have wholesale access to your internet communications, and the government justifies that under something called Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act. We have the only case challenging the Section 702 collection, but there are two other cases that have challenged the Section 215 collection, and they were split. There was one case in Washington, D.C., with a very conservative judge, Judge Leon, and a case brought by a conservative activist named Larry Klayman, where the judge said that he thought the spying was probably unconstitutional, and it's where our quote, almost Orwellian, comes from. And there was a case brought by the ACLU in New York, where the judge, issuing his opinion from under his bed, said that he thought everything was just fine and please go away. And that was a judge named Judge Pauley. Those two cases are headed for appeals. Our cases in San Francisco are still being briefed, and we will have a hearing in April. So eventually, we will probably end up with the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals here, the DC Circuit, and the Second Circuit looking at this question, and which I think will ultimately end up at the U.S. Supreme Court. So that's the story for the court cases. There's one thing that we aren't talking about tonight that I think we should, because I know people here are really fired up about trying to figure out what they can do to help stop the surveillance and protect themselves. And we've been talking about the courts, and we've been talking about Congress, and we've been talking about the executive branch, we're going to talk about the media, but there's also technology. And encryption is our friend. It's one of the technologies we can use to try to regain some of our privacies, and EFF, and I've got some of my staff members here tonight, my colleagues, have been working very, very hard to try to encrypt the internet and make encryption tools that can be useful to us. It's really great to be able to have limits on what the government does. We have to fight this in the legal and the policy realms, but it's also just really nice to be able to have a lock on your front door, and that's what we'd like to build as well on the internet. Thanks.
Thank you. Cindy, I just have one follow-up. Thank you for mentioning encryption. That's really important. What has the NSA been doing to compromise encryption? That's really relevant, if you can, please.
Absolutely. I think that that you guys should all know that you're not just a target for the NSA in terms of collecting your data, but you're a target for the NSA in that they're trying to deny you access to tools that can protect you. And we've learned in September and ongoing that the NSA has been undermining the security standards of the tools we all rely on. They've been infiltrating tech companies to try to make sure there are back doors installed in our technologies. And in addition to going in the front door and trying to get the companies that hold our data to give us the information, they've also been actively attacking some of the companies that stole our information, and to the point where, they got, 5 of the nation's leading technology companies to say, you got to stop it, government. And, those aren't people who are looking for a fight with the government, but they did issue a reasonable list of things that the government needs to stop doing when they discovered that not only was the government trying to come in the front door to get access to your data, the government was actively attacking them. So we have a lot of work to do. The NSA has overstepped its boundaries in so many different directions that it's really hard to get a handle on it all. And I think, a friend of mine says, we got to play Vulcan 4-level chess in order to try to deal with all the directions and pull this right back into something that looks like a functional and secure democracy.
Excellent. Thank you. So we come to our last speaker, Norman Solomon, who is going to address some of the issues of the media, the press, its failures, and some of the successes of the media and press, which actually we would lump together under the rubric of alternative journalism. And this is actually how the story of Edward Snowden broke. So, Norman, let me just read you your question. You already know, but for the audience. What's been the role of the U.S. news media in coverage of government surveillance? Has it changed in the last year? What role has the foreign media played, UK Guardian, Greenwald, Poitras, as a check against the surveillance state? And what can we expect, and how can we improve our press, conventional press?
What we've had happen in the last 7 or 8 months, since the beginning of last summer, is what I think we could describe as the disruption of the stenographic role of our mass media. The reliance on official sources, their reporting with very little, if any, critical acuity, what's coming down from the beacons and the mouthpieces of the national security state, the surveillance state, those who run U.S. foreign policy, and so forth. It's been a profound shift. It's been a drastic one from the time that The Guardian first reported the beginnings of this flood of revelations, courtesy of Edward Snowden. And it's such an important shift, and yet it depends now on what we're able to do with this historic opportunity. Let me give you a couple of examples of the old way of doing things, the old way that has enabled the NSA and the CIA and other agencies to trample on the civil liberties of people in this country and around the world, that has facilitated the Pentagon and the war makers from furthering their own goals without the danger that the people of the United States would know with clarity in real time what's being done in their names with their tax dollars. You may remember that towards the end of 2005, the New York Times reported that there was wholesale wiretapping domestically in the United States. And it caused a huge uproar, and at the Bush White House there was a whole lot of concern about negative public reaction. The fact is that the New York Times had that story a full year earlier, before the November 2004 election, which, as you may remember, was quite close between Kerry and Bush. But in their wisdom, the New York Times editors, led by Bill Keller, decided that they didn't want to report this information to the American people before the presidential election of 2004 because it might have an effect on the election, which is a whole new concept of journalism. You really want to report the news to the public unless it'll make a difference. Okay? So let's go back a couple years earlier. We've seen how the stenographic function, the fourth estate functioning de facto as a fourth branch of government, can shift the question of who becomes president of the United States. It also routinely shifts whether the bombs will go out, the troops will be deployed, people will be massacred, the United States enters into and continues into a war. And that, in fact, of course, happened with the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, which occurred in 2003. And we know the story about the weapons of mass destruction lies that were peddled as truth on the front page of the New York Times and elsewhere. Problem was not Fox News. The problem was places like the New York Times. They were the differential with this axiomatic knee-jerk reliance on official sources. What's much less known is that a courageous woman at her desk at GCHQ, the National Security Agency equivalent in Britain, saw on her computer screen in the first month of 2003, before the invasion of Iraq, a memo from the NSA to GCHQ talking about what they were calling a surge of surveillance on the Middle Six delegation of the UN Security Council to go after their phone calls and their emails for clearly leverage and blackmail purposes, because they were going to vote on whether the Security Council should endorse the idea, the proposal for an invasion of Iraq. That document was reported by the Sunday Observer in London, and it was huge coverage all over the world, except in the United States. And my colleagues at the Institute for Public Accuracy sent out news release after news release into literally thousands of newsrooms in this country, calling attention to this story after it broke in the Observer. Dan Ellsberg and others raised their voices to point out how important in real time before the invasion of Iraq this revelation was. The British and US governments were willing to twist every arm through surveillance at the UN in New York City to jam a pro-war resolution through the Security Council. And in the US media, well, I talked to the foreign editor of the New York Times at that point, and she said, well, we haven't gotten confirmation from the NSA that it's authentic. You know? The LA Times did report on it before the invasion, and they had information in there. They had an unnamed source with an intelligence background who said, gee, that memo doesn't read like the kind of memo that would come from the NSA. Okay? Those doubts were dispelled when Catherine Gunn was arrested for leaking the document, because generally you're not busted for leaking a document that isn't really a document, right? But at that point, the invasion was full throttle, and we got the war. Well, that's the kind of media coverage or non-coverage that Edward Snowden and Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald totally disrupted. And the people in the media and government establishment, all branches of government in Washington, they've been freaked out ever since. They've been doing damage control, they've been counterattacking. We're in a semi-McCarthyist period now, and we saw last Sunday with Mike Rogers and Dianne Feinstein about the Russians may have been involved. There's reasons to think that the Russians were involved with Edward Snowden. And as Snowden pointed out in the last couple of days, you could just parallel what Dianne Feinstein said to say, well, we don't know that Edward Snowden didn't get help from aliens from other planets. We don't know that that wasn't the case. This departure from conventional so-called journalism is the lifeblood of democracy. When you have the body politic, you've got to have the circulation of ideas and information, or you get blockage. We know what happens in the human body when there's blockage. This has been happening to our proto-democracy in the United States. There's blockage in the body politic. Now, the epitome of this old style that is created such a backlash because of such great reporting that has come from Greenwald and Poitras and others, and the independent press, and all the work we're doing online, and all the hell-raising. There's such anger in response, and it was articulated in the journalistic realm by Bob Woodward. Bob Woodward, the renowned Washington Post reporter of Watergate fame. Bob Woodward, who's had great access to one White House after another. Bob Woodward, who said recently that Edward Snowden should have given those NSA documents to him. Because Woodward said he would have known what to do with them. Okay? He is a great court recorder. He is a great journalist. He digs and provides the official story. Now, I haven't really talked about this. I haven't really talked about this publicly before, but real briefly, 6 days ago, I get off a plane in New England, and there's Bob Woodward. So I went up to him, and after some pleasantries, I said, Mr. Woodward, if I were Edward Snowden, there's no way in hell I would have given you any of those documents, and here's why. You rely on official sources. That's how we get into one war after another. Now, let me say that the hierarchies of the Democratic and Republican parties and the hierarchies of the major powerful media outlets in this country are unified with some caveats to condemn what Snowden has done and with minor tweaking to circle the wagons around the surveillance state. And our antidote to these sort of poisons of jettisoning real journalism on behalf of newspeak, our antidotes have to do with nonviolent, strong organizing resistance in communities around the country and the world, and building and sustaining and growing our means of communication to confront and challenge the mainline media, mainline in often an addictive sense, and at the same time to build our capacity to communicate so that when we have information and analysis, within a matter of hours, we can get that out to millions and millions of people. A couple of quick points before I'm done here. Last week, I delivered a petition to the Washington Post in D.C., in the nation's capital, signed by 30,000 people through the organization where I work, rootsaction.org, urging that the Washington Post disclose in its stories about the CIA that the sole owner of the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, was also the main stockholder and CEO of Amazon, disclose that Amazon now has a $600 million computing contract for cloud services with the CIA. And minimal disclosure was rejected in an email exchange with me by the executive editor of the Washington Post, Martin Barron. And when I delivered the big stack of petitions, and by the way, you can still sign it at rootsaction.org, I was told at the front desk that they don't accept petitions at the reception area of the Washington Post. And after some back and forth, the assistant to the top editor said, you should go around the side entrance and deliver them there, where UPS and FedEx does. And then I went around the side entrance. They said, no, we can't accept it either, but if you go back around to that alley and then make a left, there's a black door. And so I take it as a metaphor. I did deliver it and so forth. One final point here. I learned today at rootsaction.org, we sent out a blast around the world that the Bill of Rights Defense Committee was way ahead of us. We sent out a blast this morning urging people to sign a petition to two sponsors in the Washington State Legislature expressing support for their bill that could cut off water and electric service to the NSA's listening post in Yakima, Washington. Bravo. And when I walked in the building tonight, I checked. Since this morning, we have more than 11,000 people who've signed that petition. We're looking forward to working with the Defense Committee and others. We're learning that this is happening in a number of other states. And it's an example of how, yes, we have to defend our rights, and we also have to, in nonviolent terms, take the offensive, including in media, because we simply cannot accept this assault on our precious Bill of Rights.
So that concludes the questions to the panel. Now we're going to have a forum, and while we get set up for our forum, if you can take The question cards that are in the front of the seats on the pew in front of you, right? Fill them out. We'll collect them on the side aisle. Rainey Reitman is also going to make an additional fundraising appeal. And folks, access to the internet is totally critical at this time, and that's the fight that's going on now, okay, is equal access to the internet. So stay tuned for that, Rainey.
Thank you guys so much. I mentioned earlier this was a fundraiser. I'm going to keep my remarks pretty brief. I just want to explain how this works. We're doing a fundraiser. Every dollar that's raised here tonight is going to be split evenly between the Bill of Rights Defense Committee and the Freedom of the Press Foundation. And you can do that either by donating with cash. We're going to have baskets that are coming around in a second. You can also make out a check to the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. Any checks that the Bill of Rights Defense Committee receives, they're going to split automatically with the Freedom of the Press Foundation. Also, if you're one of the many people watching online right now, if you make a donation through bordc.org, the Bill of Rights Defense Committee's website, that money, any money we receive tonight, they will then split with the Freedom of the Press Foundation. Our idea is that both of these organizations that are so nimble, that are so powerful, that have a national presence, though they have tiny staffs, will benefit tremendously by the generosity of people here tonight. That it's not a competition, but rather an opportunity for them both to really benefit from people's generosity. I'm going to explain very briefly what these organizations do. First, I want to talk about the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, Shahid's organization. It is a organization that got started right after 9/11. Its primary mission is creative grassroots movements that push back against surveillance states that the government is promoting. They do some amazing work activating, educating, and coordinating thousands of people in hundreds of cities coast to coast. They are transpartisan. They are multi-ethnic, engaging directly with impacted communities. They do some very creative stuff. As was mentioned earlier, they are spearheading efforts to cut off municipal and state services to the Utah data center. They're not just going after the NSA data center in Utah. They're going after data centers in Tennessee as well, and they're trying to cut off services to the Maryland headquarters to the NSA. They've also worked extensively with EFF. They helped throw a protest in October against NSA surveillance. They're very good at engaging local communities to get out on the streets in the same way many of us do online activism. We talk about the NSA being a dragon, which is ferocious in many ways. I think of the grassroots work that the BORDC does as really going after that dragon one scale at a time through their grassroots activism. And of course, the Freedom of the Press Foundation is an organization that I'm very proud to have helped fund. Thanks to them, they have successfully helped WikiLeaks received funds going around the financial blockade that they faced. We helped to get transcripts of the Chelsea Manny court-martial. We did a fundraising program for that helped raise over $100,000 so we could have daily transcripts of everything that happened in that trial. And today, they are promoting SecureDrop. SecureDrop is a technology that lets journalists connect with sources securely. We have installed it in 4 different major news organizations. So actually, we have people on the road right now going from major news organization to major news organization, setting up SecureDrop so that we won't just have one WikiLeaks, we will have thousands of WikiLeaks. Any news organization that wants to receive classified information, journalists will be able to connect with sources in a secure way. And I'm also very happy to note that Edward Snowden just joined the Freedom of the Press Foundation board. So I will keep this very brief. I want to say that we are so lucky. We are so lucky to live at a time when we live with such heroism so available to us. Heroes like Daniel Ellsberg, heroes like Chelsea Manning, and heroes like Edward Snowden, who have risked everything so that they could bring the truth, so that we can understand our governments better, so that we then could make informed decisions as a public. And that is the lifeblood of our democracy, and it took risk, and it took maybe facing, in his case, 115 years in prison. Chelsea Manning is to this day in prison, and Edward Snowden is unable to return to his own country. And when I am faced with such heroism, I cannot help but wonder if there are things that we can do in our own lives to be courageous. And I'm asking everyone here tonight to be courageous in donations. I'm asking you to perhaps dig a little deeper than you normally would and help us support these amazing organizations that are doing such incredible work to defend civil liberties, to push back against government surveillance. And I particularly want to thank one individual who's been very generous and has agreed to give tonight $5,000 to match any donations that are made tonight. Please give a round of applause for John Gilmore. Now that $5,000 is only going to go into effect if, to the extent that we within this room can raise $5,000, and those online who are watching can raise $5,000. So I myself am going to be making a donation. Know that anything you make will be doubled up to $5,000. And for those watching online, please go to the Bill of Rights Defense Committee website and make a donation. Your donations also will be included in that which is doubled today. And I just want to thank everyone for all that they're doing. We couldn't do this without your generosity and without your commitment to making sure that these organizations move forward. These organizations rely on individual donations. That is the blood that keeps them going, and then that is how we all can contribute and make sure that there is a strong movement pushing back against National Security Agency surveillance abuses. Thank you.
Thank you. Please dig a little bit deeper, because this is really how we fight back with $5, $10, because it goes to these foundations. And the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, Freedom of the Press Foundation, who really do the fighting for us, and the litigation, Electronic Frontier Foundation. So one of our speakers here, Shahid Bhuttar, is a gifted constitutional lawyer, very gifted, great speaker, a poet, a DJ, MC. Thank you. And Shahid has a poem to read for us, a rousing poem, please.
Thank you, Bob, and thanks all for being here this evening. Rainey mentioned the Stop Watching Us rally in Washington, D.C. that we organized with several dozen coalition groups in October. This is a piece that I read from the stage there on the steps of Capitol Hill. The NSA breaks the law every day. It doesn't matter who you are or what you say, they monitor your phone calls and emails anyway. Corrupt Congress and courts paving the way. There is a lesson you'll learn someday. Watch what you say. They spy on your mind, record your calls for posterity, commit daily executive crimes with impunity. They're the authorities here to keep us safe until inevitably the boot ends up on your face. It's the NSA versus the Constitution. We the people are the ones our government is abusing. We can force any agency to make a new choice when we build a movement, each raising our voice. They lie about the origins of the evidence. They lie about the numbers of Americans watched immense, too large for them to calculate, they say. We're talking about the NSA, computing power unmatched in human history, presuming the power to wiretap humanity. It's insanity how large the hubris looms. The government's watching you in the bathroom, and they lie about it at every opportunity. Sustained abuses of every community. unity across Washington, D.C., all three branches against you and me. See, Bush signed in secret a presidential decree. Obama talked a big game, but presidentially did everything he could to entrench the Bush legacy, a complex composed of military industry, predicted 60 years before. Eisenhower said it would be rising in the wings for generations growing. A crisis in democracy sowing. The future is at stake. You can start by knowing it's the agencies against the Constitution. We the people are the ones our government is abusing. We can force any government to make a new choice when we build a movement, each raising our voice. Back in the day, during World War I, it was the FBI versus free speech holding the gun. Hard-fought constitutional rights on the run. The Palmer Raid's the first, but not the last one. Fast forward 40 years to the real Red Scare. McCarthy did a number, but the FBI was there. Dude, they were everywhere. They knew what you wore to bed. They prosecuted people for the thoughts in our heads. They tried to drive MLK to suicide. No one even knows why Brother Malcolm died. Fred Hampton killed in his own house. Inside, they even bombed Earth activist Judy Barry's car and lied. And those lies go all the way up the chain of command. The FBI and NSA lie to judges on the stand. The director, the head honcho, the man claims his lies were unplanned, and he didn't understand that it's the FBI versus the Constitution. We the people are the ones our government is abusing. We can force any agency to make a new choice when we build a movement, each raising our voice. What does it mean to monitor thoughts? Spying means a lot more than watching what you bought. It's them always knowing what you've got in your head. Not only whoever with whom you share your bed, but whether you're compliant or a threat. Instead, whether a head like MLK to be neutralized. That's the word the FBI used after decades of lies were revealed, exposed as institutionalized. Speaking of lies, a lot of people think Edward Snowden is a traitor. They forget everything that happened later. Congress lied to by executive officials. We're talking about corruption in the Capitol for shizzle. Democracies fizzle when their people are watched. That's why the NSA's got to be stopped, and the FBI too. Don't forget what they do. Entire agencies arrayed against you. DHS, biometric, data collection, surveillance drones, automatic, license detection, departments of corrections eclipsing universities. We must all resist or we'll be history. It's the agencies against we, the people. Don't stoop, don't grovel to no government steeple. We can force any government to make a new choice when we build a movement, each raising our voice. When we build a movement, each raising our voice. You ready to try it? When I say civil, you say rights. Try it. Civil. Civil. When I say individual, you yell rights. Individual. Individual. When I say constitutional, you yell rights. Constitutional. Like you mean it. Constitutional are the things that make us American, right? It is the Bill of Rights that unite us across our races, wherever your blood comes from, whatever you believe. It is our rights that have made us American. Your rights need you to survive. You need them to be free, and you need each other to secure them. So thank you for being here. Make sure you meet somebody new tonight.
Bravo. So we have a few questions here that are interesting. I picked one because that's what we began the program with tonight, was the little birthday message to me from Google. Happy birthday, Robert. You know, where do they get that? They obviously have my birthday somewhere. But this question is interesting. I'm reading it. The panel discussion is formed around the issue of government surveillance, but corporate surveillance is even more pervasive, and it enables the surveillance state. Shouldn't we be as focused on the overreach of corporate power as much as on government surveillance? You know, before I give that to the panel, that's almost a separate issue, because the telecom giants really are part of the surveillance infrastructure. They manufacture the appliances that have portals. They cooperate to the maximum, even in getting around some of the encryption. So I'd like to pass that question on to Cindy. Yeah. Did you follow? Shall I read it again? Or?
No,
You got it.
It's a question I've been asked before, as it turns out. I think that it's the days in which you could think about corporate surveillance different from government surveillance are over, right? That doesn't mean there are, and decide which one you cared about, you know, and let the other one go. We, as the questioner points out, the collection of our information and our decision to let third parties go, to use an email service provider that stores things on a central server rather than sucking everything down into your computer. We used to call that POP. We've all made decisions that mean that our papers are being held by third parties now, and it is this thing called the third party doctrine, where the courts have said you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy in information that's being held by third parties, that is undermining a lot of our privacy right now. So we have to fix the third party doctrine. It's just a ridiculous legacy idea. It doesn't really fit with the way people live today. And so that's one way that we can begin to step up against it. The other thing is to put pressure on the companies that hold this data to not hold it any longer than they have to, and to limit what they can do for it. The EFF has done a lot of work in this regard. We've been the major supporters of something called the Do Not Track button, which is the idea that your browser ought to be able to record your preferences, and you ought to be able to say, don't track me, and the websites you go to have to abide by that. And we fought for this thing tooth and nail, and the corporations, especially Google, frankly, have been really bad about it. So yes, we have to pay attention to both pieces of this. We don't have the luxury of just deciding that we're not going to worry about the government, we're only going to worry about corporations, or we're not going to worry about corporations, we're only going to worry about the government. We don't have that luxury as a society. We have to look at the whole picture. Having said that, you know, the last time I checked, Google can't withdraw your passport when you're in the transit lounge in the Moscow airport. And Facebook can't put you in jail. So it is important to recognize the differences between how these two entities use their power and to use different forms of attack. You can't make a First Amendment challenge against a private company except in very narrow things too. So the tools have to be different, the conversation has to be different, but in the end, we do have to move into a world in which we have more legal, policy, and technological protections for our data than we have now, because it's clear that we don't have enough.
Thank you.
Bob, a couple quick points on that, if I could. We see the figure of 70% of the NSA work is being done by private contractors. Where was Snowden working and getting access to all that information? It was a private corporation run for profit. Where did all these people like Michael Hayden go in the revolving door? They went to cash in through private contractors. When I was working on this Washington Post CIA issue, I started seeing in my Google email pop up offers for my CIA career that was awaiting me if I would just get the training and click. And one other aspect of this, which is really mind-blowing, and I think we're just beginning to grasp, that is a metaphor but a literal problem with the fact, you think about it, you're Jeff Bezos, you have $25 billion in personal wealth. You're the sole owner of the Washington Post. You're the CEO of Amazon. And you have a tremendous trove through Amazon of billions, if not trillions, of factoids about people and what they do and where they are and what their habits and attitudes are around the planet. And your whole raison d'etre in the corporate world is to monetize things, right? Profit. And then, meanwhile, you're in a contract relationship with a central intelligence agency, which also puts a crucial premium on secrecy and information. Is there a firewall between those concerns? I don't think so. And where are the barriers to monetize all of that information between Amazon and the Central Intelligence Agency? Just for example,
The lifeblood of our protest movement, of our resistance, of our alternative journalism is the internet. And most of you probably are aware that there is a struggle for dominance of the internet. There's been several decisions, one recently by the DC Court of Appeals that gives the telecom giants the upper hand in regulating the internet. That's a direct threat to us, direct threat. So I have a question here. It's a very knowledgeable question. I'm not going to read it all, but it poses the question is shouldn't we be struggling about that? Who would like to take that? Shahid, do you want to answer?
I think it might make more sense for Cindy to, only because the EFF is very centrally engaged in net neutrality as a battle, and it's certainly an important issue, but I think you're closer to it.
I admit that because I've been writing a brief about spying, I haven't been able to read the decision that came out, but I know the rough outlines of it. I think we have a very difficult challenge with regard to the internet, because, I, for one, don't want AT&T, we want a neutral internet, right? You don't want a situation in which you have to pay to play in order to have a website. Your website ought to be, you cover the basic expenses, but you don't have to pay in order to make sure people can read what you're writing. That would be a really, discrimination like that would be a real big problem. On the other hand, I, for one, was very uncomfortable with the way the FCC had decided that it could basically be the god of the internet and issue really, really broad regulations. The basis upon which they claimed it was this thing called ancillary jurisdiction, which basically means we can do whatever the hell we want in terms of writing rules. Well, many people here have been involved in the media consolidation fights and fights involving the FCC. I don't think they are the best champion of the public interest in terms of our media. I think they're a captured agency. And so I was very, very nervous and frankly not surprised at the court decision that struck down the way that the FCC was going about regulating the internet. Well, that doesn't answer the question about what we should do here. I think that there are serious problems and not a clear answer for how best to get to a neutral internet. The first thing I would start with, though, is to try to focus our attentions on the duopoly, right? On the fact that the broadband market is, you can't vote with your feet. There used to be tons of little ISPs. I used to use landlines, and here in Berkeley we had a bunch of little ISPs. That doesn't, those guys all got stomped on because we don't have antitrust law, we don't have competition law in this country anymore. And as a result of that, the normal mechanisms by which people can pick their small local mom and pop service provider, which frankly you could build, right? The technology doesn't require the big behemoths. I actually think that the way, for me anyway, to think about network neutrality isn't like who ought to be the god of the internet in terms of issuing regulation, but how do we make our competition law work again so that we can have choices that are better than Tweedledum Verizon and Tweedledee AT&T. And that's actually, to me, the way to begin thinking about how to solve this problem. It's not an easy problem to solve, but I think that going around and demanding that the FCC take control of the internet, we may end up in the internet just as cool as the radio spectrum, right? That was they regulate. So I just don't think they're the people we should entrust with that kind of broad power without a lot more careful thinking and a lot of limitations on what they can do. That's my perspective. It is not the mainstream perspective, but that's mine.
Thank you.
If I may just
Thank you, Cindy.
Just want to say one thing. So I'm going to try just to connect the last two questions just in a second. So that if you think about the battle for the soul of the internet in the 1990s, a lot of people thought it would be this engine toward a new sort of generation of democracy. You'd have a proliferation of voices. Anyone could speak to anyone, anywhere. And that had two components, right? It was both the opportunity to put your information up for others to see without having to pay to play, as it were, and it was also the opportunity to see anything without being watched. And both of those principles are under attack at the moment, just to point that out. And what at one point could have been a very liberatory infrastructure has been, for all intents and purposes, transformed into something much more insidious and dark, and we all use it every day. Going to the point about corporate surveillance, I would reiterate Cindy's point that Google can't detain you. On the other hand, and this is a problem, particularly in the wake of the president's speech last Friday, the president, among the few meaningful things he said, was supporting an end to indefinite data retention by the NSA. He still supports bulk data collection, but thinks the private sector is a better place to house it. As Cindy mentioned, you have fewer hooks for legal control over private entities. The Bill of Rights only applies to the government. So giving the data to the private sector could very easily be leaping out of a frying pan into a fire. So if the president formally ignored most of the 40 recommendations of his own review board and had some meaningful lip service to pay to 3 principles, at least one of those principles could be regressing relative to the current baseline. And the last thing I just say here, well, it's 3 things I'm going to say. These are 3 words that I think people don't often connect to the NSA controversy. The first is corruption, because we're talking about public taxpayer dollars being essentially embezzled in secret, given to private corporations for the express purpose of abusing your rights en masse. I can't think of a more sordid enterprise in corruption than that. The second is very dark, and I hesitate to use it in a house of worship. It is the F word, fascism, and that represents the alignment of corporations and the state in the service of abusing individual rights, promoting xenophobia, militarism, belligerence, what have you. You see in the military-industrial complexes domestic metastasis through domestic surveillance in the NSA and the contractors, what it can look like with a more softer face. And then the last word, and this I hope to be somewhat inspiring, is if we are facing nation fascism, what we have to combat that is the vestiges of our democracy. And we should take our cues from democracy struggles around the world and in our own history, which combated, quite frankly, much more deeply entrenched opponents, right? The battle to end slavery was not as hard as the battle to put the NSA genie back into the bottle. The battle for civil rights in the South and to end Jim Crow, which in the face of mass incarceration, we clearly haven't won yet. The battle to end Jim Crow was harder than the battle to put the NSA genie back in the bottle. So as hard as intractable as our opponents might seem today, we have beaten worse foes in the past.
Yes. The effrontery of the telecom giants to be entrusted with the telephone metadata while they're beating us up over access to the internet is just ultimately as arrogant as you possibly can get. Dan's going to read the last, this is going to be our last question, but it comes from a number of you said, well, we need some surveillance, and so what are the boundaries of the surveillance, the good kind of surveillance? And Dan's going to read the question.
Well, you've said it pretty much. The question is, how do we ensure the safety of our country while ensuring the freedom of our communications, et cetera? What should be the boundaries of acceptable surveillance, et cetera, to ensure we are also protected from, quote, the bad guys? The bad guys are not all foreign from the point of view of protecting our Constitution, as a matter of fact. I believe, for example, that the man who was critical, well, I'll put a little more emphasis on Richard Cheney, let's say, than George W. Bush, but the two together, plus their counsels like David Addington and John Yoo and others, who in effect suspended the Constitution, I think, at the end of 9/11, in their own minds, were in the sense of the oath I took, which was not an oath that Snowden took when he was in the CIA. You don't take an oath for Booz Allen, but you do for the CIA. And every member of Congress is not to secrecy, and it's not to the president. It's to defend and support the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I say, not rhetorically, but very soberly, I believe that Richard Cheney was a domestic enemy of the Constitution in that sense, of that oath. And when I say enemy, I'm not just referring to the fact that he violated the Constitution, as did Nixon and Hoover and LBJ that I worked for, and all the people in this system. They were all violating it, but they didn't all ideologically oppose the idea of a government with separate branches, independent branches, and a Bill of Rights and various else. And I believe that Cheney actually, and Addington, and John Yoo did believe that long before 9/11, that we needed an autocratic, essentially monarchical kind of government in an indefinite period. Going back to the Pentagon Papers, that was his attitude at that time, and the Iran-Contra scandal, and he was open about it, and he had every right to say we need a different constitution suited to this emergency of welfare. He didn't have a right to act on that belief after taking an oath to defend this constitution, the one we had. And they pretty much have ripped it very much, and I come back to the point, when I say this is a crisis, I mean that in a good sense, that it is a challenge to us. We know now what the problem is to a large extent. Even the president admitted that he knew the problem in his preamble, which was hard to disagree with. It's just that, as I say, his solutions have almost nothing to do with changing the existing situation in which the Constitution, in which our liberties are strongly endangered. Now, when it comes to terrorists, to people who plan to kill innocents, non-combatants, for a political purpose, which I oppose across the board for everybody. When we do it, when the Arabs do it, when Israel does it, whoever, I oppose that in every respect. Is it appropriate to be listening in secretly on the conversations of people where you have probable cause, not just reason to believe, but even enlarge that for intelligence purposes, reason to believe even that someone is planning a terrorist act? You did not need the Foreign Intelligence Court to get a warrant to go after such a person, obviously, or the people who are communicating with that person. You could easily get a warrant from any court from that. What you couldn't get are the general warrants of the kind that led to this revolution in this country, as a matter of fact, by the British. Everybody, go anytime, at any time you want, listen to everything. You don't have to have reasonable cause, you don't have to have probable cause, you don't have to have reason to believe in everything. That was one of the main factors that led to the revolution. And as I was listening tonight, and my hearing is such, I'm afraid that I miss a lot of what was said, so I was reflecting on the main points. And it occurred to me when the president talks about Paul Revere, for example, and as a surveillance function, what chance would there have been of separation from the British Empire? What chance would there have been of the American Revolution if the British had had remotely the kind of surveillance capability that our country has right now? What would have happened to Paul Revere? What would have happened to Paul Revere? He would have been hanged like Nathan Hale, who in fact was the American who was hanged for giving information to Americans, as I did. There are people right now, James Woolsey and others, who said Edward Snowden should be hanged by the neck until he is dead. Well, Nathan Hale is the one who said, I regret that I have but one life to give for my country, before the British hanged him. He was a spy for Washington. I find that young people don't any longer learn that so much. Edward Snowden is both a Paul Revere, the redcoats are here, is what he's saying. The empire is here, it's not just coming. But he is in particular Nathan Hale. The reason he's a personal hero of mine, as is Chelsea Manning, is that each of them said they were prepared to give their life for their country. And the country that they were prepared to give their life for was the country with this Constitution, this written Constitution, not Richard Cheney's and David Addington's Constitution. And so I think that courage. Why do we rely then for the security of our persons and information and associations from government intrusion, that's the Fourth Amendment, without a warrant, an individualized warrant, specific, based on probable cause or anything else? Why do we rely on whistleblowers to tell us about that? Because regrettably, humans being what they are, it seems to turn out, people who run for office, by and large, with a few exceptions, who I could name, and people who run for president, and people who work for presidents, do not, it turns out, value the Constitution enough to risk their clearances or their jobs, their careers, their income, their marriage. These are serious risks. None of them risked prosecution because before me there had never been a prosecution. And before Obama there had only been 3, and 2 of them were thrown out. So they weren't worried about prosecution, or they didn't have a realistic worry about prosecution. But losing their status, their access, their job was enough to keep them, thousands of them, who knew we were lied into Vietnam, and I was one of those, and knew 30 years later, 40 years later, we were lied into Iraq, and knew that what the NSA was doing was unconstitutional and destructive of our democracy. None of them took any risk, except Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden, and they took the ultimate risks. Let me modify that a little bit. There were leaks, there were important leaks, in fact, that were selective enough and narrow enough that they didn't risk much prosecution, and they were good. In fact, another thing that occurred to me, if we are not torturing now, and I say if, because we wouldn't necessarily know it, who leaked that for the years it was going on? How many did? Joseph Darby brought it out, and for that his whole family had to go into a witness protection program, in effect, to leave town when he did it. The guy who revealed Abu Ghraib, the abuses at Abu Ghraib. But for years that went on. Without the leaks, would Obama or Romney or McCain have ended that practice if the public didn't know about it? I'll make a judgment. No. The fact that it came to public attention through a leak, only through leaks, is why, if we're not doing it, is why we're not doing it. And the same applies to what the Post got Pulitzer Prize for: rendition, that is kidnapping, to torture zones, CIA torture bases. Without those leaks, which the administration felt should be prosecuted, that would still be going on. The warrantless wiretaps, finally somebody leaked on those, we don't know who, but without those leaks, that would still be gone without warrant. Well, how much changed? The Congress people, a majority of them, not all of them, but a majority, when it became public, tried to investigate, asked questions, got nothing, were totally stonewalled by this, and accepted it, and then legalized the warrantless wiretapping in effect. And then we have the Foreign Intelligence Court. The president is saying they have to issue the warrants. They are the people who issue general warrants. This is a mock, a facade of jurisprudence. It has no relation to actual court proceedings of any kind. It's a mockery. And as I say, I come back to Congress, those people who swore to uphold the Constitution. We have a Barbara Lee, who one person in all of Congress who said we should not be giving the president a blank check like the Tonkin Gulf Resolution without any hearings, without any process, without any decision. That's unconstitutional, as Morrison Gruning had said 40 years earlier. One person. One person voted against the Patriot Act, Feingold, with Sensenbrenner, the architect of that act, now saying, I never dreamed it would be interpreted in this way. But people hadn't even read the Patriot Act when they went for it. In other words, I'm saying the system that was designed by the founders, who were very imperfect humans themselves, like everybody, a lot of them were slaveholders, and that's pretty bad. And they formed a constitution that protected slavery in the slave states and whatnot. But they had some very good ideas. And those ideas are the separation of powers, congressional investigation, impeachment, Bill of Rights. All of those are worth, as Snowden says, dying for. They are worth dying for. So when I say this is a crisis on which we do not have this president or any president we're going to get of either party on our side on this issue, because no president is going to say, I'm getting too much information for you guys to analyze. I can do my job without all this. 2 panels, in answer to the question, 2 panels now, one today, and the President's Commission, including a former head of the CIA, including Richard Clark, the counterterrorism chief, concluded that this program, as it exists now, the question is, are we ensuring our country, has done nothing to protect us from terrorists. Nothing they can identify. So we don't need that. And, what that means is that every one of the plots they have prevented have been prevented otherwise. And that means that they had reasonable cause without this surveillance of everybody on which to get warrants for anybody they needed it. And that should be the kind of system we go back to. Thank you.
I have two quick announcements, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Bob. The first is there are two people in the audience today who are organizing hackathons to help people create liberty-enhancing technology. I'd like those people to stand up and raise their hands. One right here. Is the other one still here? Okay. No? Oh, in the back? No? Oh, right here and right here. Okay, keep your hands up. Hands up. I know it's uncomfortable. Keep your hands up. If you are an engineer, if you're technically inclined, if you want to help protect liberty on the internet, if you want to help create secure technologies, I want you to find these two people right after this event, and I want you to see how you can get involved, and they will have the details of these two different hackathons. Thank you. You can sit. And I also wanted to mention that February 11th is a day of action against NSA surveillance. People all over the world will be taking activities, and there's going to be actions in San Francisco. The action planned is going to be at the AT&T building on Folsom Street. It's going to be at 6 p.m. It'll be at 2nd and Folsom. I'm sure all the different organizations represented today will have information on their websites about it. I apologize I wasn't able to have information on a flyer about this, but feel free. 2nd and Folsom, the AT&T building, February 11th. We will, at 6 p.m., be having an action against against NSA surveillance. Those are the two announcements I had to make, and I'm turning it back over to Bob.
Okay, we're going to, thank you. We're going to close the program. Before we do that, one of the ideas that we've tossed around here at St. John's, actually, Daniel, is to have you come and do an institute here. To come and do an institute of teaching, just to come back here. So there's a number of, thank you, really. Yeah. So you can see there's a number of other programs that we'll be doing. So we're going to close the program. Thanks to everybody for coming out. Please give whatever you can on your way out or on the website. I'd like just to mention got it. I just want to mention our sponsors: BORDC, Freedom of Press Foundation, Coalition for a Sane Berkeley, Code Pink, Muslim Legal Fund of America, National Lawyers Guild, Network of Spiritual Progressives, that's Beit Tikkun, Occupy Bay Area Jewish Contingent, Proteus Fund Security, and rootsaction.org. So, everybody. Yeah. Thank you. All of you.